So, let's talk about Traumacore. Traumacore is a type of aesthetic that is typically used as a coping mechanism. I will put the official definition up on the screen, but you can see how this may be controversial. Now, I have seen a lot of people saying that this is valid. I've seen a lot of people saying that this isn't valid. And I wanted to educate you guys on what it is. Overall, you can make the decision yourselves, but I believe it is valid. I believe it is okay, and I believe that there is no harm in it. Some of you still may be confused, like, oh, what's Traumacore? So, I'm going to show some examples, but first I want to make a trigger warning or content warning for derealization, mental breakdowns, obviously trauma, and basically just vents. So if that stuff kind of bothers you, you should click off. Here are some examples of Traumacore. They are typically images, usually Cutecore related images, pastel pinks and Sanrio characters, but dirty and broken or abandoned rooms, and they typically have text over them saying some kind of event. Now, Traumacore is a way for people to cope. It is a way for people to sort of anonymously let out their feelings. It's also sometimes a great way to vent because it's different than just writing out a vent or talking to someone. It's like putting your emotion into an image, and that can be very useful for a lot of people, me included. And it's a little bit similar to vent art, which is problematic on its own, and I may make a video discussing that, but overall I believe that Traumacore, vent art, overall the concept is not bad, but sometimes the way it's executed can be bad. When people see the word Traumacore, they're going to assume it's bad. I mean, core is usually used at the end of a word for an aesthetic, like Cutecore, nursecore, medical core, gyaru core. I'm so sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that, but it's typically put at the end of a word to make it an aesthetic. Many people think, they see Traumacore and they think that this is making trauma into an aesthetic, that like, oh, I have trauma, it's so aesthetic to have trauma. And some Traumacore creators may be doing that, and that is just not the case of what it actually should be used for, what it's supposed to be used for. It's not an aesthetic based on trauma, a category, a genre of images called Traumacore, and they are basically ways to vent about your trauma. So it is people taking their real and existing trauma and venting about it through images, and that is called Traumacore. It's not saying that trauma is an aesthetic. That's not what it's doing. That about wraps it up. I think it's valid. I think it's a perfectly good way to cope, but the people that take it and they make it like an aesthetic is not okay. But using it as a way to cope and using Traumacore as a way to express your emotions and vents, I don't think that's a bad thing. So as long as you are not making trauma itself into an aesthetic, but simply choosing aesthetic images, I believe that Traumacore is valid. I really don't think people should be bullied and like harassed online just because they use Traumacore to cope. I don't think it's that big of a deal. That's the end. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.